Hi, we're back again with our lo-fi, no budget, no video editing, uh, econ tutorials. And today what we're doing is getting introduced to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So let's just jump right into it. This short clip is about the aggregate demand curve. So let's start by asking a question. Is it possible to put every single good and service that we produce in the economy into one graph? And the short answer is yes. So let's think through this to get to how that happens, okay? So we'll start with our individual micro graphs, micro markets. And I have four of them for you right here. And you've heard me talk about my love of coffee and my love of pizza. Okay. And so let's just talk about these curves very briefly. We know that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So, for example, if pizza is $3 a slice, I'm not getting any. But if it's, $2 a slice, maybe I'll get one piece of pizza. If it's $1 a slice, I might get two. And if it's three, I might get three. Because in the end, even though the price is monetarily free to me, there's only so much space in my stomach and I don't want to feel sick. Okay. So, here with my pizza, even if it's free, I'm going to have a limit to how much I consume. All right. Well, anyway, so, we could take my individual demand curve for pizza or for coffee, and we could add it to your individual demand curve for pizza or coffee. And then we could add it to everyone else's in a particular place and time. And we would wind up with one of our typical micro market graphs where we start to analyze how a cohort of consumers and a cohort of producers responds to various prices, and in the end, where that market finds balance. In other words, equilibrium, where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And the hope is that we have a market clearing price and there is no excess and there is no shortage. Okay. Now, if we took all of our goods and services, if we took all of our individual demand curves for the goods and services produced and provided in a nation's economy, and we added all of those curves together, we would wind up with our aggregate demand curve. Now, when we looked at micro markets, the common factor that tied all of our graphs together and allowed us to add them together horizontally was the price per unit, whether that was per cup, per slice, the price of each unit and the quantity that we would demand at that price. But, can we take a specific price of one of those goods and services to bring all of our goods and services together? And the short answer is no, that'd be crazy. As we saw here, the price of video games is very different from the price of coffee, the price of pizza, the price for a gallon of gas. Okay. And so we can't use one discrete price and try to use that as a reference point, but rather, in our ADAS model, we're taking the trend of the prices, and we know that prices tend to move together. They're like molecules of water in a wave, and so they tend to trend together, trend upwards together, trend downwards together, and we have ways of tracking that, right? And so, for example, we study the inflation rate, and that helps us to understand how prices are tracking as a group. Okay, now, um, in this model, when we're looking at the trend of a set of prices in an economy, what we do is label that the price level. And that's what we find on the y-axis, the price level. Okay. And so on our y-axis, we're going to have PL labeling that axis for the price level. All right. But I've got a couple of cheat codes for you to help you think about how and why we're using that label and what's really going on with that particular axis. Now, you're never, ever, never, 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 ever going to put these cheat codes as actual labels on your y-axis, but I'm just putting them there to help you to think about the dynamics of what's going on there. Okay, so for example, we've got the inflation rate and the nominal interest rate. Okay, so we know that as inflation increases, in other words, as our money loses its purchasing power, the prices go up. Okay, that is the very definition of inflation, is that it's the loss of purchasing power of each unit of money. Okay, and so anyway, our price level goes up as our inflation rate goes up. Okay, and then also as our price level goes up, something to think about is that our nominal interest rates are going to go up as well, and we're going to delve into that much more in our money unit. So this is just a basic intro to the ADA, the aggregate demand curve in our ADAS model. Now let's turn here to our x-axis. So our x-axis, well, what can we use for quantity? And what we, in our previous unit, we already learned how to measure the quantity of output of all the goods and services of a particular economy. Okay, and that's GDP. And we also found out that we have a preferred approach to GDP. So that's real GDP. And so you can see our GDP output. I've used that here. You might just see our GDP. You might also see national income. So those are all synonyms for each other. And that makes sense because if we think back to our circular flow model of the economy, we know that the money that businesses are paying to the factor market, okay, that is flowing over to the households, and those households are getting all that income, all those payments from businesses, and that then becomes the money that they can go and turn around and use in the product market. And so, the money from the factor market should equal the money that is spent in the expenditures. So, national income is also equaling our expenditures in the expenditure model. So, here we are going to use the expenditure model in our class to think about how this curve will shift in the short run in one of our next videos. But anyway, a little reminder of that is our SIG-X formula, and I cover that in another video that's based on our expenditure method of calculating GDP. Okay, so anyway, so we know now that real GDP output, or national income can be used to label our x-axis. In other words, that's our quantity that people are willing and able to consume depending on our price level. Now, sometimes going back to our y-axis, we might expect to see some numbers there. Now, what numbers might potentially be put there? We might see CPI, or we might see our GDP deflator. Now, we know that CPI is a discrete basket of goods. It's based on the consumer's experience of purchasing a discrete basket of goods, but it's still tracking inflation. And so if we get that number over here, or if we get our GDP deflator, we could multiply that times whatever real GDP output number they give us down here, and that would give us our nominal GDP. Okay, and so that is an introduction to the basics of ADAS and how and why we get to this curve. We'll talk more about the dynamics of why it has an inverse relationship between price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded. We'll talk about that in another video. But for now, thanks for showing up to our lo-fi, no budget, no video editing macro tutorials, and I'll see you next time. Bye.